Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Bride from 2025 with an exclamation point. Starring Jessie Buckley, Christian Bale, Peter Sarsgaard, Annette Bening, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Penelope Cruz, directed by Maggie Gyllenhaal. Funny that brother and sister are working together in a movie, whereas the sister's directing and the brother is acting. So, was I excited for this movie? I was interested, I'll say that much. And I have seen the movie twice, and we'll see if it holds up after two viewings. Let's get into the movie. We start with the narrator, that is Mary Shelley, played by Jessie Buckley, when she gets an idea to write about what happens after her book Frankenstein, as she writes about the bride. As she makes up a name for the bride, calling her Ida, also played by Jessie Buckley. And we push forward to 1936 in Chicago, when Ida is drunk and has more drinks with some friends, including some people's, in a bar owned by a mobster named Lupino, as she vomits on one of her friends, James, and talks shit about Lupino and causes a scene with someone punching her while accidentally killing Ida. And I don't like how these characters mumble, as I had a very hard time understanding a goddamn thing they're saying throughout the movie. Frankenstein, or Frank for short, played by Christian Bale, goes to Dr. Cornelia. Let me see if I'm saying this name right. Irfuronius, played by Annette Bening, for intercourse purposes, and by definition it means he wants a relationship with the bride for him, made from a dead woman, until Greta comes in and freaks out over Frank being in the building looking the way he does. And he goes to the cinema to watch Ronnie Reed, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, act on screen, and sees himself as the dancers in the scene, and stays with Cornelia as she studies him and helps him make a bride, as Frank is lonely, and they dig up where Ida is buried and resurrect her. And the acting is kind of corny in a bad way. And the shots in this were sometimes very hard to see to nor understand what the fuck was happening on screen. After resurrecting the bride, who is also played by Jessie Buckley, with an iconic look, she doesn't understand what the fuck is happening. While I do like the makeup on the characters, as that was a good makeup job. While Cornelia looks at the bride's leg as it looks injured, and tried to remember what happened to her when she died, as she envisions Mary Shelley by talking to her, and suddenly wakes up the next morning and scares the shit out of Frank, and he accidentally hits her, and then he shows off his dance moves. And the choices being made by director Maggie Gyllenhaal with the actors was mediocre in my opinion. But so far, this is kind of a mess of a movie. Cornelia, Frank, and the bride have breakfast together, while the bride makes a mess of the dishes and wants to go outside, but Frank helps her out with that, and they go to the cinema together and go to a club, as well as imagining them in a dance together like in the movies, like until the bride gets to the restroom and shows off her tongue as she gets a new look and is being harassed by a couple of young jackasses who thought about raping her, dare I say that word, until Frank beats the living shit out of her, those motherfuckers, as he saves her life. And the cinematography was kind of hard to see, like I said, and I get this movie takes place at nighttime at times, but can't you afford lighting in your movie, as that bothered me for half the movie. The bride and Frank get their pictures taken in the newspaper, and he tells her to leave because he doesn't want to get her in trouble, and she decides to go with him in hiding. And another thing that bothers me is sometimes we go back and forth with Mary Shelley as the bride dreams of her, but it doesn't change the fact that it bothered me as she wakes up next to Frank while not breathing on the train, and they hide from the authorities and an angry mob until they move again and almost get caught because the bride singing, but she saves his ass from getting shot dead. And we get Jake, played by Peter Sarsgaard, along with a partner who happens to be a female detective named Myrna Malloy, played by Penelope Cruz, as they'll be the detectives looking for the bride and Frank, which did feel convenient, As the movie goes in a predictable but yet unconvincing direction, the bride wants to fuck Frank, but he declines for now because he's not comfortable with it. While we get to know Jake and Myrna as detectives, but at the same time, I don't like them because I don't like the characters at this point. That I could care less whether they made it or not. As we go back and forth between Jake and Myrna, and scenes with Frank and the bride are, as it kind of annoyed me while the bride and Frank go to the movies, watch a 3D monster movie, and we see a couple of smooching as the girl says no to a point. The bride smacks the guy around, and he calls her out in fear because they're monsters. And I thought, what the fuck was the bride doing? Trying to get caught? As that was bad and annoying, as this movie is muddled. The bride and Frank go to a styled party where Ronnie happens to be at, while Jake and Myrna looks for the monsters as they're in disguise. As Frank sees Ronnie and tells him how much he admires him, and Ronnie says he doesn't remember him while filming a movie together back in 1917. And Ronnie disrespects him until Frank makes a scene in front of Ronnie by dancing, and people start dancing in the party until the cops start coming in with Jake and Myrna coming in, and the bride steals the gun from a cop and points it at Ronnie, and that's when Jake recognizes the bride as Ida, and she talks about Lupino, excuse me. And if you know Jake was in, never mind that, but it was predictable because of the darkness. They hit it very badly. Frank and the bride run out of the party, and Jake following behind them and recognizing the bride as she and Frank get married and go on their honeymoon, like, well, maybe kind of like a Bonnie and Clyde situation thing, not officially married, but like getting a tattoo of and comforte and comfortably having sexual relations with the bride, while Claudia and Greta see it in the newspaper, and people are painting their faces like the bride and cause some robberies or terrorist attacks to go after Lupino as he shoots one of the cops in the head. And this is not the story I remember from the previous movies, but don't get me wrong, the production design and set decoration was probably the best thing about the movie, which, and that ain't saying much, as Jake grieves over Ida being resurrected. At this point, I was just bored with the movie at this point. The bride and Frank get pulled over by a cop while driving. The officer searches the bride in a weird way as she was about to be raped once again. Dare I say that word? Until Frank shoots the officers to death, as well as ripping her tongue out, and it makes the cops look so fucking stupid for messing with a couple of monsters. And they run into a forest in Niagara Falls. Jake, Myrna wait for them at the movies as the bride can't breathe once again. And I must say now, this movie's a little too long at 2 hours and 6 minutes. I'll give this movie a 4.6 out of 10. I don't like the characters mumbling, which was a bad choice, and I had a hard time understanding a goddamn thing they were saying throughout the movie, as the acting was kind of corny in a bad way. And the shots in this were sometimes very hard to see nor understand what the fuck was happening on screen. Well, I do like the makeup on the characters, as that was a good makeup job. The choices being made by director Maggie Gyllenhaal with the actors was mediocre, and the cinematography was kind of hard to see. And I get this movie takes place in the nighttime, but can't you afford lighting in your movie? As that's kind of bothering me for half the movie, and and going and the movie goes in a predictable but yet unconvincing direction, and I don't like the characters to a point I could care less whether they made it or not by the end of the movie. They they're going back and forth between scenes of Jake and Myrna, and the scenes with Frank and the bride did annoy me, as this was muddled and a mess. And this is a weak non-recommendation for this movie, as they are trying to hide things for a later act, but they did a poor job with it, in my opinion. And this is not the story I remember from the previous movies, but don't get me wrong, the production design and set decoration is the best thing about the movie, and that ain't saying much. And by the end of it, I kind of didn't like the movie as much as I wanted to be a better movie, and it was just all over the place, and it was just a mess. So I was pretty disappointed. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this whole Frankenstein retrospective series leading up to this movie, The Bride. And until we ever get another version of the story, till death do us part.